I'd like to begin by talking about what this paper is not. It is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a thorough examination of the concepts of nations, states, or nation-states. Although they are mentioned, this is not an in-depth discussion about them. And although they are mentioned in their commonly understood sense, I think I should mention that I tend to personally gravitate toward these concepts in their more classical sense. That being said, any accurate examination of the right of self-determination and its effects on peace must look at how it has previously been understood, how it is currently defined, and its practice in modern times. Going back, one of the first and most popular discussions on the right of self-determination can be found in Emmerich de Vattel's magnum opus, The Law of Nations, that he released in 1758. Vattel put into words what had existed in practice for centuries when he described self-determination this way. And I quote, "If any nation is dissatisfied with the public administration, it may apply the necessary remedies and reform the government. But observe that I say the nation, for I am very far from meaning to authorize a few malcontents or incendiaries to give disturbance to their governors by exciting murmurs and seditions. None but the body of a nation have a right to check those at the helm when they abuse their power. When the nation is silent and obeys, the people are considered as approving the conduct of their superiors, or at least finding it supportable. And it is not the business of a small number of citizens to put the state in danger under the pretense of reforming it." However, Vattel went further. He said this, "If therefore the state or the prince refuses or neglects to succor the body of people who are exposed to imminent danger, the latter, being thus abandoned, become perfectly free to provide for their own safety and preservation in whatever manner they find most convenient, without paying the least regard to those who, by abandoning them, have been the first to fail in their duty." Unquote. Now, Vattel's work, specifically how it verbalized the right of self-determination, was at the time earth-shattering. So much so that it was not uncommon to see copies of Vattel's Law of Nations in the hands of revolutionaries for the next 100 years. Famously, the book was even distributed to members of the Continental Congress in the newly independent colonies in America, and, as attested by Benjamin Franklin, was a source of inspiration for the American Revolution. Now, as Texans, we are very familiar with the principle, not only from our Texas Declaration of Independence, but through words that have existed in some form in every Texas Constitution since 1836. And the words are these: "All political power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit. And the people have, at all times, the inalienable right to reform, alter, or abolish their form of government in such manner as they may think expedient." Now, Vattel's distillation of the fundamental right of self-determination informed independence and sovereignty movements, not just in Europe or America, but around the world, all the way through the end of the Second World War. You see, the principle of self-determination as embodied in current international law can be traced directly from Vattel to the Atlantic Charter in 1941. In a post-war clamor for international peace and order, it was Vattel's definition of self-determination that led the international community to uniformly recognize it as a fundamental right. Indeed, it became the cornerstone of the United Nations Charter and the growing body of international law since. Through these institutions, the world declared and agreed that nations have the right to freely choose their sovereignty and international political status with no external compulsion or interference. In fact, Article 1 of the United Nations Charter itself states that one of the main purposes of the organization is, and I quote, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. And it goes on to say that it is to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. Even in the United Nations Charter, the concepts of self-determination and peace are connected. But while Vattel and current international law and principles seem to be in agreement, the modern recognition of self-determination as a mechanism of universal peace seems to have been an utter failure. At least that's what the opponents of self-determination would have the world believe. The prevailing argument from these opponents seems to go like this. Self-determination is not a right. It's a privilege. Therefore, when nations claim it as a right, they are in rebellion. And rebellion is destructive to global order and universal peace. Hence, self-determination is only permissible in instances where major world powers agree. Consequently, because major world powers are the final arbiters of the privilege of self-determination, they exclusively have the right to ignore it and a duty to interfere with it to expand their interest and preserve the existing global order. You see, that is the prevailing argument from opponents of self-determination. And it's not a new phenomenon. As a matter of fact, one of the most poignant examples of this conflicted nature can be found in the American president Abraham Lincoln. In 1848, while in the United States Congress, Lincoln vigorously argued against continuing the war between the United States and Mexico. And it was at that time on the floor of the United States Congress that Lincoln uttered these words, and I quote, "Any people, anywhere, being inclined and having the power, have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. This is a most valuable, a most sacred right, a right which we hope and believe is to liberate the world." Now, it was this same Lincoln, now president, in 1861 that launched a military campaign against states that had invoked that sacred right to exit the American Union. And the subsequent conflict ultimately cost over 600,000 lives. This one example seems to be the standard of behavior even into the 21st century, with its proponents saying self-determination is great, just as long as it's convenient. It is this lack of respect for self-determination and national sovereignty that has been a major cause of violent conflict for the past 100 years. And while I could trace this connection back for 1,000 years, I'll restrict my judgment on this matter to the post-Vattel era. So the question that we must answer is this: does the recognition and respect for the right of self-determination contribute to the peace? Now, it is important that we restate that we are indeed dealing with two competing ideologies. One held by people seeking to exercise the right of self-determination, and the other held by states and systems which seek to preserve their interests and the status quo. But one ideology has clearly shown that it contributes more to the peace, while the other has created more conflict and cost countless lives. Take, for instance, the conflict in East Timor. In 1975, after decolonization by Portugal, the people of East Timor declared independence. This independence was followed by invasion and occupation by Indonesia, which, by the end of the occupation, cost an estimated 110,000 lives. After the right of self-determination was recognized and extended to the people of East Timor, there was peace. Or take the example of Sudan. Engaged in a 22-year civil war where the people of South Sudan invoked the right of self-determination, the conflict to deny them this right cost an estimated 1 to 2 million lives. Recognition of their right of self-determination brought independence to South Sudan, and with that independence came peace. These aren't the only examples, but are two modern, notable examples where the path to peace started with the recognition of the right of self-determination. Where peace is the preferred path, and the recognition of the right of self-determination is a key component of achieving that peace, nations, both recognized and unrecognized, face two serious challenges, two serious questions that must be answered. The first, how do we address a lack of respect for self-determination by major world powers? And second, how do we address the obvious international double standard which exists in both law and practice with regard to the right of self-determination? How nations and people answer these questions will dictate the course of history over the next 100 years. I believe, like any fundamental right, there will always be those who disregard and suppress the exercise of self-determination. But until the world begins to view and defend self-determination like it views and defends other fundamental freedoms, there will continue to be violent conflict. We know that the right of self-determination and its recognition is not the sole determining factor in establishing peace, but it cannot be overstated how important and fundamental it is to both create and maintain peace. You see, self-determination is like air. You need food and water to survive, but without air, you will die. For us to live in as peaceful a world as possible and minimize violent conflict, the right of nations to self-determination must be respected.